Static WordPress, how WP Codebox helped me go serverless. In my last blog post, I was floating the idea of moving from WordPress to a static site generator, or SSG, called Astro. Instead, I made a local install of WordPress into my own static site generator. WP Codebox, although not essential to this, made things much easier for me to move towards a Jamstack approach. And this is going to be in two parts. First, I'll give you my reasons for this change as a follow-up to my last post. And secondly, I will give an overview of how this new setup works using a simple live site. I'm not sure how much demand there is for more detailed how-to content on this, but if you think there is, then please let me know in comments. So I'll start with my reasons for using WordPress for static sites. The first is familiarity. After nearly 2 decades with WordPress, the idea of working entirely within a code editor seemed quite a leap. This is rapidly diminishing, but I certainly needed a stepping stone to get there. I've never had much capacity for learning code, as it's always been a means to an end for me. And even the CSS I considered I knew had changed so much that I needed to start from scratch. Fortunately, if organized, CSS is more logical and designer friendly than it's ever been, and personally I found it easier to learn than Gutenberg. And I'm pleased I went this route, as recently almost every element of a website has been subject to a better alternative. And I'm talking about things like site-wide CSS grid layouts, variable fonts, AVIF image optimization, responsive art direction with images, HD colors, and there's many new units and ways to organize styles. I can't imagine much of this coming to builders soon, because their aim is to save users from being overwhelmed or needing to understand the wider CSS concepts. Stability is the next reason. This became my main problem with WordPress as a live platform. I began to feel my clients were paying an unnecessary amount for hosting maintenance of software, only to be treated like guinea pigs for developers' commercial experiments. Existing client sites became the battleground in which plugin authors slugged it out to be the #1 game changer to bloat sites with features. The constant cycle of updates brought dread for me, but with a significant rise in security issues at the same time, there was really no getting off it. Now, I don't blame developers. They needed to appeal to new customers as existing ones got more impatient and less loyal. And I don't blame the customers, as they were hooked in by the thrill of a constant supply of game changers. But the upshot was that I started to lose control over my business. And even worse, I discovered that most of my present clients didn't actually want to learn or use a CMS. So now I'm only using the permanent and basic features of the WordPress CMS, things like shortcodes, custom post types and field. There's no plugin or Gutenberg dependencies. It's just my tool. And honestly, I'm loving it again, pretty much like I did when I first discovered it in 2007. The clients are now going to get an unbreakable site with no indication that WordPress was involved, and they're not going to be paying for my lack of updated skills. This money is now going to go into ongoing improvements. And I think this use of WordPress presently feels more stable than using a static site generator. Astro made only a few minor breaking changes with its last update to version 2, but even that could be an issue to someone like me who relies on tutorials from a year ago. Speed is the next reason, and that's because many of the client jobs that I've been getting have been about rebuilding old or broken WordPress sites. And this route allows me to quickly import some of the content and metadata. Support is the last of these. AI tools have been well trained on the basic PHP WordPress code that I'm using, and just generally help is easier to find compared to the new static site generators as things are at the moment. But importantly, I've tried to use WordPress in a similar way to how I would have worked if using Astro. So if needed, I could swap over without affecting clients. When I later show how I use WordPress HTML snippets served as shortcodes, via WP Codebox in this case. It is the rough equivalent of what Astro is doing with its slot tag. I should say that I am, because I'm working locally, using a beta version of WP Codebox version 2. This will be out soon, but for proper updates on this and new features, it's probably best to follow Ovidu, the author's excellent YouTube channel, and join his Facebook group. In terms of this content, the difference between version 1 and 2, I think, is the implementation of shortcodes, and a big one for me is the change of editor to Microsoft's Monaco editor. This is the same as the popular VS Code editor, which I would also be using if I was working with Astro. If you're unfamiliar with serverless or edge hosting, which is probably a better name for it, it's about sending site files to global content delivery networks or CDNs and serving them closest to where the user is. There's no single server to manage, update and make powerful enough to cope with unexpected changes, and it's much cheaper. In fact, it's free for me at the moment, secure, greener and faster. You may have heard of headless WordPress, which is a way to go static via WordPress's React API. Now, I'm not doing that. My thoughts on this are probably best summed up by this image that was sent to me from Nathan at WP Builds. Moving from a PHP dependency to a JavaScript framework dependency wouldn't really make too much sense for me. Additionally, React's popularity is waning and some developers now see it as a mistake in the development of the web. Nevertheless, JavaScript more generally is replacing PHP, and it looks like serverless is the future. The fall in the live use of PHP is seeing that those types of CMSs are declining across the board. Now, WordPress is presently holding ground, but probably due to the surge of new DIY users created by effective marketing of third-party page builders. Many of these using them for businesses have yet to learn that what you see is only a small part of UX design, and there is the long term to consider. Also, with the growth of headless WordPress, this will be mostly indistinguishable from those running live PHP. So as you can see here, if we look at the top 10,000 sites, there is a kind of visible drop in WordPress use. Now, let's talk now about the local setup. So I'll just set things up for that. Okay, let's look at my local WordPress setup. It's presently being refined over a number of new client projects, but surprisingly I've taken on work that I would have before considered too complex when running WordPress as a live platform. With the exception of forms, dynamic content for the site visitor is almost never needed for my projects, and if it is, then I prefer that the client knows this responsibility lies with a third-party API. The first site to go live with the new setup is a very simple one. It's a new domain, so we wanted to get something out quickly that could be indexed by search engines and build up content for SEO. The visual design needs some embellishment as the focus went on the blog and YouTube videos. What I like is that it is fast and lean. If we inspect, we can see that there is very little output. And some things need further adjusting here. So the CSS is all internal with the same global CSS across all pages. So even the uncompressed, just under 5 kilobytes of unused code on this page will probably be reduced later. I've been using local WP to spin out my WordPress installs. I like the UI and that I can clone and organize sites easily and save them to Google Drive or Dropbox. Obviously, WordPress needs a theme to run and I have no PHP skills, but it only took a couple of days to follow along with this excellent free course by Mr. Digital to have my own theme. And since then, I further simplified things by handing much of the work over to WP Codebox. So if we look in the header, footer and single post PHP pages here, I'm echoing out shortcodes to HTML snippets that I've added to WP Codebox. I found also that with ChatGPT or WP Codey by the same author as WP Codebox, that it's easy to find what I need. For example, on another site, I wanted to add via the native custom fields in WordPress a person schema for each entry on a custom post type. ChatGPT just quickly gave me all that I needed to add to the theme. Now, I can't be sure that the code is the best, but it really doesn't matter. The theme's not live. It's only the output that matters to me. Let's move on to WP code box and the folders that I've set up. There's various folders here to organize my snippets, and the content varies depending on the site. And this gets imported via my personal WP code box cloud space that I have. But what I have at the moment, and let's start with functions, and this is a section that uses snippets to replace plugins, again with the help of AI these days. I could have used a repository plugin for something like duplicate posts, but this should not really need to change, and I wanted to just skip the chore of having to update only to find there is an advert or that the plugin does something completely different now. Now, I'm not using here any custom post types, and I wouldn't need to set up a snippet for that soon, as this is coming, a generator is coming to WP Codebox. Let's move on to WordPress performance, and this is where I keep snippets that remove the extraneous stuff that I don't need in WordPress or that has been added over the years. So things like emoji support, feeds, the WP generator meta tag, and Gutenberg. I have moved the images to their own folder called images and bypassed the media library, and I also bypass the WordPress menu system. I use the Squish app for image optimization and resizing. It is absolutely brilliant. And I have a shortcut to the image folder on my desktop. And this allows me to treat images according to the situation. So I can use a HTML picture tag to serve differently cropped images to different devices, or choose a newer image format and still have a fallback for older browsers. I can stop lazy loading on above the fold areas for performance, and remove WordPress's image title for better accessibility. I'd not previously paid much attention to how the media library could harm performance, but without services like ShortPixel, which can't work locally, WordPress does seem to increase the file size of the images it crops up to 15 times the amount and takes 30% off the quality. Now, this might just be my local WP server, but either way, WordPress automatic approach to responsive images can never be optimal, as it treats them all as if they are full width. Let's move on to the global areas, and this is where I keep most HTML snippets saved as shortcodes that go in the theme as shown earlier, in pages, and also within other shortcode snippets. In the header, I have a shortcode for the nav or menu, and if we go over to the menu, in this case, it couldn't be more simple. But if I wanted a complex mega menu, there are lots of people out there sharing their code, so I could add this, and of course there is AI. I like that with a mobile first full site CSS grid setup, I could have easily had the nav at the bottom of the page on the default mobile layout where people's thumbs are, the user's thumbs are, and have it then jump top right on larger devices without having to duplicate the code output, which I would need to do if there was a Flexbox setup. One of the nice things about the new Monaco editor that's used in WP Codebox version 2 is that it includes Emmet to speed things up. So if I wanted to write the above, I could type UI, unordered list, and then LI for my list items, put the number of list items that I want, select an anchor tag and select that as a link, and it just speeds everything up. There's lots of other things that you can do, like add in the amount of lorem ipsum that you want. I think this, combined with WP Codebox's autocomplete, has removed much of the chore of writing code that really led me to favor page builders. The off-putting thing about code was the overwhelm of a large page of it, or having to move from file to change something like a menu item. This is gone with global areas like headers, footers, and in this case there's a call to action section which can be kept off the main pages, or most of them. In the call to action section there is another shortcode to the form. In this case I'm using Form Spark. I've got a lifetime deal. I think it might still be available, and this sends to the client, but there are lots of similar services, growing number of them, to capture all those people who are going static. It gave me the HTML I needed here, and it showed me how to do things like redirect to a thank you page, and it offers on their site a range of anti-spam options. Okay, let's move on to the pages. Again, they are HTML snippets turned into shortcodes. So I create the WordPress pages in the usual way and then add the shortcode to them. Where possible here, I use basic semantic HTML tags like main and section. And with my CSS grid setup, I rarely need to add a class selector or a div. And sections here in the editor are easy to collapse if we need better focus. In the pages, I can also add in some further short codes, which I've called components, to reduce the code overwhelm even further. So components, they are really my equivalent to page builder modules or widgets, and I can use them for things like galleries or accordions. I use HTML snippets again here, and mostly include the components specific JavaScript and CSS. Inline additions like this were seen as bad practice before, but now more as a performance booster, and Google recommend it. There is one exception here, something that's different, and that is the YouTube lazy loading, which is used on the blog here. This is actually in this case assigned to the theme and to a video category, but this is too much to get into, but it was a fairly easy thing for me to do. Finally, there is the style sheets, and this is something I'm working on a lot. I've avoided frameworks like Bootstrap and Tailwind because I wanted to be able to tell clients that they fully own the site, at least the static output, and that any front-end developer should be able to take over. But I am using a slimmed down version of OpenProps by Adam Argyle, who's on the Google Chrome CSS development team. And this gives me a battle-tested system of CSS variables, or custom properties, that makes use of modern CSS like fluid typography, calc, and things like setting character length. This has helped me get design consistency and give me global control over all of my styles. It doesn't take me long to create an entirely different look because there's no plugins here that are adding in their own HTML and CSS. So this is quite a nice system. I don't use the color system that they include, but I like here that the editor makes it easy to swap to different formats. Presently, LCH, Lightness, Chroma, and Hue is not in the editor, as I think only Safari and just recently Chrome supports it. But it's likely to be the new norm as it provides a much wider color gamut, or is known as the HD colors, and it stops things like that horrible banding that you can get when you go through gradients. It just makes everything more vibrant. With the main layout and grid, I'm taking the section tags that are on those pages and positioning them with nth child 1, 2, and 3, etc. It means that I don't have to commit to adding project-specific class names to everything. And this isn't a CSS grid tutorial. I don't even know if I could do one, but I am using a grid template column here to map out the main areas on this particular particular snippet. So in this silly example, if I wanted to swap the header and footer positions around on larger devices, I could just go to my grid area for each and swap the names around. I've called these B1, 2, and 3 for body 1, 2, and 3, but you can call them what you like. As I say, I'm still redefining this, but once you've set up the homepage layout, it only takes a few lines of code just to adjust this to the other pages. There's so much to talk about here, but I think that's probably the basics of my WP Codebox folders. Here I'm using some blog posts, and these are done with the classic editor, or rather the tiny MCE editor. There's not much to say on this, and there is so much to say on what I'm doing on the other projects and how I'm using custom post types and custom fields, but it's just too much to cover here. Even though support for the classic plugin is being limited, I can't see tiny MCE being removed from WordPress as it's in Gutenberg via the classic block. But if they do, ChatGPT has already shown me how easy it is to reinstall it myself. And with all of these things, the worst case scenario is that I don't update WordPress because I don't need to now for security, or I could even move to Classic Press, the fork of WordPress, or it just make it the time that I move to Astro, and then until I get fully set up, I can still manually update the code via VS Code. One mistake I think I made on this site was on the blog. I started to reassess the concept of the blog archive. The WordPress standard, which I've never really thought about, was set before the issue of weak or duplicate content started to annoy search engines. And we put our reliance on fragile SEO plugins to tell search engines our priorities. I've noticed though on most sites that the archive page is rarely visited, and further pagination or authors pages, as I've got on this site, is really not gone to. So I'm thinking, why not just skip the whole archive thing and have section links on one page, which I can lay out in a nice way, and the visitor of course can get access to everything in one go. Presently I am using Slim SEO, but I'm probably will drop that on newer sites for custom fields, as it's easy to replace this. Okay, let me finally move on to how I flatten the site. So I started by using a plugin called Simply Static, and it was great, but issues have been increasing with recent updates, at least for me, probably not affecting other people. So I switched over to using this free tool, which is SiteTech web copy program. This is just for PCs, so Mac users might want to check out SiteSucker from Rick's Apps. I've not tried it, but there are other options out there. All I need to do with this one is to add my local site's URL and then send it to a folder on my desktop and just kind of press the clone, and it does everything. There is some finer tuning available should I need it, but I haven't so far. And when it's there in this desktop folder, this is watched by my local install of desktop GitHub. So it's watching out for those changes, and it shows me exactly what those changes are and which files are affected. If I'm happy with this, then I push the updates to my private repository on the GitHub site, which in my case is automatically picked up by Netlify, which in turn deploys them to the CDN, and they are using Amazon Web Services. Now, all of this seems quite complex at first, but I think it's no more so than the first time, for me at least, I installed WordPress on a server, or the first time I used a theme or a page builder. At least when you're working locally, you can't accidentally publish a draft, and it's easy to roll back site-wide changes. What I like about this is that I have another website backup on GitHub with version control, and I can share this with any developer from any code background, and they can work on it, they can take it and branch it. Netlify is great and I think user friendly, but there are a growing number of similar services. What they bring to the table is ease with this GitHub integration, but also a way of doing things that we'd usually expect to do with a server. Things like 301 redirects, 404 pages, and pretty URLs. It seems pretty hard to exceed their free allowance, which is 100 GB of bandwidth per month, and really my build minutes don't show up very quickly. So I imagine that I'll be running quite a lot of client sites on it before I'll need to pay anything. Anyway, I think that's quite enough for me. Thanks so much for your time today, and I'm very grateful if you managed to get to the end of this. Hope you have a good day or night, and please leave me a comment if you think you want to see more of this type of content. Obviously, I'll go into more detail and do shorter videos. And of course, subscribing and liking my content here is always very much welcome. Anyway, bye for now.